My name is Arun Jagtiani, and I'm a proud St. Martin. In a few short weeks, our country is going to be heading to the polls to elect 15 new members to Parliament. There's 126 candidates from 9 different political parties that are contesting this election, and I think the entire voting population can benefit from knowing a little bit more about who these candidates are. Over the next few days, I'm going to interview a few new faces and a few political veterans. So join me, St. Martin, and let's talk politics. Welcome to another edition of Talking Politics with Arun. We're joined today by the number 2 candidate on the DP list. He is the current Minister of Health, Labor and Social Development. He's the former president of the Caribbean Hospitality and Trade Association, the former president of the St. Martin Hospitality and Trade Association, and I'm sure his resume goes a lot longer than that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Honorable Minister Lee.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you for being here.
Great.
So this is your second run on the campaign trail.
Yes.
Is it exciting to be out on the streets again with your posters and campaigning, interviews, debates, and how does it feel the second time around?
You know, it's interesting. The first time when I ran for Parliament, it was a very short lead-up time because when I resigned from president of SHTA to run for elections, it only gave me a couple of months. So now the lead-up time is much longer. And honestly, I think the other parties are feeling threatened. And so I feel like there's a lot of guns pointed in my direction, and I think that's good. That means that I'm doing a good job. I think that means that people, the establishment is afraid of change, and then they've singled me out. So that's interesting.
You know, it's only your second campaign, and something you alluded to just now in that statement. You have quickly become a household name in St. Martin politics. Your campaign slogan this year is "Delivering Change." What change have you delivered thus far?
Well, you know, my campaign slogan in the first election was "Real Change, Real Solutions."
Correct.
And so I'm really happy that I've had the opportunity now to serve 9 months as minister, and that I could really deliver change. And I think if you look, for example, the hospital project, which is very much on track, but also we're talking about labor reform. So we're talking about addressing not only the 6 months contract, but also labor reform. And not only reform, but with a total consensus between business, unions, and government. So 100% unanimous consensus on a proposal for fairly radical reform. Also, we're talking about national health insurance. That's also gone through Council of Ministers and now is beginning its consultation process. So these are all game changers for the country.
Sure. And if given the opportunity, what other changes would you like to see rolled out if you're given another term to serve?
You know, a lot of the things that we're working on are really the beginning stages. I mean, for example, the hospital, while we're trying to finalize the project, obviously there's a lot more that needs to go with it. So for example, how do we reform the health insurance to make sure that it's all financially sustainable, to make sure that's done well? I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of improving the quality of medical care in general here, and that means sort of redoing the structures with family physicians, making sure that proper feedback loops of system of sort of checks and balances to make sure that the quality of care is really the right level for the people. So there's so much work attached to the projects that we're working on.
Sure.
The labor reform, all of that, we're talking about putting in a pension that travels with employees. So there's really, these are things that need a lot of work to continue. So we've laid a good, solid foundation, but there's work to do. And that's what I'd like the opportunity to do, is to finish that.
Excellent. So let's talk about the hospital. That has certainly been in a lot of headlines in the last few weeks. There's definitely another party out there that has been somewhat critical of the plan that's put forward. Tell us a little bit, why is this the right deal for St. Martin, in your opinion? You
know, I've said it before. The process that we've used, I think, is the right process. When I came into government, we found a project that had zero transparency to it and had an expensive price tag to it. And what we did is we started it from the beginning. I said, look, number one, if we do this, we're going to do it in a consultative manner. So we're going to make sure that the input of stakeholders is there, and also that it's done in a public and transparent manner with bidding.
Yes.
So everyone, the stakeholders, meaning public health, the ministry, the hospital, specialists, family doctors, all of them had an opportunity to have input in terms of what the hospital should look like, what specialties are needed. All of that was done in a consultative process. And then we've gone through a public bidding process that's been rather rigorous, and I think I'm very proud of it. I think what it's yielded is a project that's the right hospital for the right price for the country.
Excellent. And how solid is this plan? One of the things I think that's very frustrating for the taxpayers of this country is we've had so many changes in government, and oftentimes what happens is a great project might get started, the opposition comes in, clears the table, throws it off the table, and starts from scratch again. And then that whole process kind of repeats itself. How solid is the work that you've done with the current hospital, or can a new government just come in and start all over again?
Remember that when we came into government, we weren't even sure how long the government was going to be in office, because there was talk about elections sooner than September, right? There was talk about elections in a very, very short time period. So my attitude from the very beginning has been, let's make sure that whatever progress is made is solid, that we make solid steps that can't be undone. And that's why if you look at the hospital project, you know, we've developed the terms of reference. I believe that step was solid. We've gone through a public bidding process. I believe that step is solid. So everything we've done, because in the end we're spending taxpayers' money, as you alluded to, right? So every time you start a project and undo it, that's time, that's energy, that's money that's lost, and it's the people who pay for that. So our objective has always been to make sure that whatever progress has been made, it can't be undone, right? And that's our attitude towards the hospital as well. I think, you know, I have to be candid. I think that the interest in undoing this project has to do with greedy, selfish, financial reasons. I believe that the only reason, because the process included everybody, right? All the stakeholders were involved in it. So why would you want to undo it? Do you think that, you know, the project was evaluated by like 25, 26 people from the hospital, from the ministry? Do you really think that the process was flawed?
Right.
We even opened it up to a process where the other bidders could make comments and they could review it. And so we've done it as openly and as transparently as possible. So for me, the only reason to undo it is because you weren't happy with the result, because you want to bring somebody else in, because you have, again, I believe, a personal, financial, political gain, and that's what the country's tired of. If you look at it, for example, the ship jumping issue.
Yes.
The ship jumping issue is not so much of a legislative issue, it's a moral issue. The politicians who have jumped ship for personal reasons. And if you look at each one of them, you can see it was done for personal reasons, not for the interest of the country. And I believe the people who are trying to undo the hospital and trying to confuse the public, it's exactly the same thing. It's for personal reasons, not because it's in the interest of the country.
Interesting, very interesting, and thank you for being so candid. We welcome that on this show for sure. I remember a few years ago when you were the president of the SHTA, we had a conversation about the taxes and the tax code on the island. There's definitely a feeling within the business community that those who are paying taxes are being overtaxed or heavily burdened. Meanwhile, there's a huge amount of non-compliance. We spoke many, many years ago, I'm not sure if you remember the conversation, but we spoke about the need perhaps to switch to more indirect taxation. Now that you've had the opportunity to serve in government and perhaps see it from a different perspective, do you still have that same belief that we need to switch to indirect taxes?
Sure. Okay, let me give you two answers to that.
Please.
Number one, I agree that the consensus is that compliance is fairly low. I like to go on what I call field trips. I go out with the ministry because I like to get a first-hand impression as to what's happening.
Yes.
So I've gone out with the inspectors and gone to different businesses, and it's funny because when you talk to them, again, it might not be, you know, the first answer is, oh, I didn't know that was the law, right? So, but you and I, we both have children, and if you want your children to comply to the rules of the house, you have to make sure they understand what the rules are.
Of course.
And so actually what we've done is we're just completing a compliance guide for employers and for employees. So we've taken the point on this, gone to different ministries, put together a quick compliance guide that will, as a quick reference guide, and we're going to hand it out to employers and to employees and say, here are the rules to which we expect you to comply. And then we're going to be back in 3 months to see if you're compliant, right? So I believe that will in itself already drive compliance up. If you look at it, if you try and go on the internet and really try and find out what do you want me to comply to, it's very hard right now to find it.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
How do you expect people to comply when they can't find it easily, right?
Sure.
So that's one point. The other point, and you touched on it, is should we move to indirect taxation? The fact is the world's changing. I mean, in the past, my purchases, for example, on Amazon were fairly minimal. And I think almost everybody you talk to now is purchasing more and more online.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's an economic reality that we need to acknowledge. The turnover tax is a destructive tax. The turnover tax is layered, and it provides a disincentive for you to purchase locally, right? So because you purchase locally, you're penalized for doing that. what are we doing? We want to support our local businesses, not penalize them. So at least we need to talk about balancing the playing field. And I think then you have to look at some sort of a fee on materials that are imported. Otherwise, you're never going to level it out. And that's a trend. It's happening in the States as well. I mean, you've seen it. You have big department stores who've gone out of business because the economic model's changed. So either we adjust with the times or we suffer.
We suffer the consequences.
That's right.
Yeah, fair.
That's right.
Another topic that you've made a lot of, or a fair amount of headlines with, is the adult entertainment industry, or what's referred to as the sex workers. That's an industry that functioned on St. Martin status quo for decades, since I was a kid, actually. I can remember that. It was kind of a hush-hush status quo, no questions asked. But one of the first things you did when becoming the Minister of Health was you addressed this issue, and you took steps, proactive steps, to regulate this industry. What was the incentive there? Where are we now? Has it been resolved? Is there finally an agreement that everyone is happy with? And what was your motivation to regulate that industry?
So this discussion started really from a memo from the prosecutor's office and there were a couple of court cases as well. And what it was saying, or was implying, was that government, in the way that it was currently operating, was somehow complicit or supporting human trafficking. Okay. And that's where the problem came. And you have to understand that while some of the clubs operate, perfectly fine, there's also been a lot of examples of instances where they haven't operated correctly. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So when the women would come to the island, the clubs, for example, would pay their expenses to come. They would pay them their plane ticket and money for them to pass through immigration. The girls would get here and they'd say, oh, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought I had to do, and they want to go home. And then the club would take their passport from them and say, no, you have to pay this money back. And that, in essence, starts amounting to human trafficking. So our perspective towards it is, it's an employment agreement. We actually do not give permits for sex workers, we give permits for adult entertainers. Okay. So that means exotic dancers, or what they call animirmatias, right? Okay. So you cannot have a labor agreement saying you are obligated to perform sex, because that again becomes human trafficking, forcing people to do things against their will. Gotcha. So now we've revised it, we've said you're not allowed to take people's passports, you can't stop them from leaving the premises. If they want to leave, you can't create this financial burden that prevents them from leaving. So we've put elements in place that I think have done a good job in terms of protecting the workers that are coming to the island. And I think we've done this in consensus with, again, that's a big part of how I work, is I like to try and come to consensus. It doesn't mean everybody gets what they want, but in the end you get an end result that's fair and balanced. So the clubs are happy that their industry can move on. I think the girls are better protected, and government is not exposed.
It's not liable to. Okay,
exactly.
So there is now a permanent solution that's been put in place for this, or is it still?
There's a solution that I think is a good interim solution. Okay. There's discussions about a more permanent solution in which the girls would basically become sort of a sole proprietor. But that's something that we won't be able to tackle before elections, and that'll be something for the next government to decide if they want to tackle. Okay. But I think there's a good, solid solution there now. Okay.
Another story that's made headlines, but not necessarily with your name attached to it, but I'm just curious to get your take on it. A young man by the name of Rolando Bryson, who was appointed for director of STA, and you and I have had many conversations about the importance of the STA for the island and its product moving forward. What are your thoughts on how that situation has unfolded?
You know, I know Mr. Bryson. He had applied for a position at SHTA, and I've seen him speak before, for example, with I think it was the Video X Games. Sure. And he's a very articulate person. I mean, I can see how he definitely communicates well. But I think that the evidence that's come out in terms of how he's conducted himself in the past certainly leaves you to question his character, how he operates. And I think that the position of director of the STA is too important a position for the country to leave it in a position that you're not sure about how people are going to behave ethically. So personally, while I would love to see him in a good position, I think that position's an important position. And also the fact that he had problems, given an opportunity to resolve it, didn't resolve it until the issue really popped up again. All of these are things that I think are concerning, at least.
Fair, fair. I want to ask you a loaded question now, and we'll try to keep the answer short and sweet, although I know you could probably go on for hours on these topics. It's 3 questions in one, so to speak. First of all, would you agree with the statement that as a country, we are essentially going to be paralyzed if we don't address the dump GB and our internet/cell phone services on the island? My thought is if we continue to fall behind in these 3 areas, forget about all the foreign investment, everything, it's all pointless, because with those 3, I think we're going to crumble as a nation. Would you agree with that statement, or is that too much of a doomsday scenario?
I would agree with it. Look, again, we've talked about it, the world's changing. Internet is no longer a luxury, it's a basic utility. You need it. And actually, even if you look at it from an education perspective, St. Martin would benefit better than most other countries from all of the educational possibilities that are available by internet.
Sure.
And by not having high quality internet that people can use, I think it really is a disservice to our country.
Absolutely.
Also, as small businesses, you know that a lot of solutions nowadays are cloud-based solutions.
Absolutely.
You see businesses look at those possibilities, but you say, I can't do it because I don't trust my internet access.
Right.
And it's also too expensive. If you compare what we pay compared to other countries,
Don't get me
that's
started
something
on
that
that.
needs to be addressed. The dump, for sure, it's a health risk. Remember, it's a problem that's evolved over time.
Of course.
And I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say, you know what, I believe that we've been talking about a waste-to-energy plant for so long that, in my opinion, it's only, again, because this constant changing of government, this greed, corruption factor, that's the only reason these projects don't continue and finish, is because we don't start it clean. So start it the same way we've done the hospital, a waste to energy, some sort of a plan for the dump has to be put into place.
Has any consideration been given to maybe export the garbage? There's other bigger industrial countries out there that are doing waste to energy. Is there a market for us to just ship the garbage to those, or is the
I
study
suspect
not?
not. I suspect it's
Okay.
too expensive.
Okay.
But I'm a big fan of Singapore because Singapore is a small island,
Sure.
no resources. They have many similar challenges to us. If you go online, if you look, they have a video about how they manage their waste, their landfill.
Very
It's
interesting.
amazing what other people do with their stuff. So I think we don't need to recreate the wheel. There's lessons we can learn from other people. And that's why I don't understand why this process starts, stops, starts, stops. It's something that there's a right solution for it. Again, if you do it in an open and transparent manner, I believe that we should be able to accomplish something quickly.
Sure. And what about the GB? What's just a frustration from the whole community? I think I'll sigh for everybody on that. What are your thoughts on that, and what would the DP propose to improve that situation?
I share your frustration, the constant power outages. Again, these are problems that have evolved over a long period of time. So I'm not that familiar with what the real financial issues of it are. I do know that they've ordered a new generator, and that should help to improve the stability of the power. But again, we do need to look at alternate energies and start looking at how do you have an energy policy plan that takes that into account. Because it is complicated, because if you look at it, if you put a solid energy plan into place, an alternate energy plan, you're actually building a double infrastructure.
Sure.
So on the short term, the best investment is in conservation. You still go into places, you see them with incandescent light bulbs, you still see them with inefficient air conditioners. So actually the best expenditure investment is how to reduce our energy consumption, because that's a guaranteed payback, right?
Fair.
So
Fair.
I think that's our first step, is to incentivize that type of investment.
Okay. Thank you so much for being candid with us on all topics. And one more question I'd love you to be candid about. As Minister of Health, I'm very curious, and even social development and labor for that matter, I'm curious to know your thoughts on a possible cannabis industry in St. Martin, both recreational and medicinal.
We've had this conversation
Yes.
in the past. And this is a topic that is sort of flourishing throughout the Caribbean.
Sure.
And this is a topic, as you well know, is been discussed globally. I do believe that as a first step, it would make sense to look at the medicinal use of marijuana.
Fair.
There's a lot of discussions about how it helps, in particular, patients who are going through chemotherapy.
Yes.
There's a number of medical applications to it. And I think as a starting point, because we're a very religious culture, there's very sort of strict culture, and I think that it takes time for people to kind of adjust their comfort level with different topics, and I think cannabis is one of those. But I do think there's solid evidence for the medicinal use of marijuana, and I think that makes a good starting point for the industry.
Thank you. And finally, in conclusion, on the early hours of September 27th, when all the votes are casted and counted, and chances are it's going to be a coalition. I think everyone I've spoken to is kind of in agreement with that. When you're sitting around the table, and hopefully DP's there with a few seats at the table, is there somebody you would prefer to form a coalition with?
Wow, that's a loaded question.
Yes.
I think the reality is you have to look at who the party, who the winner of the seats are going to be. So in other words, if you just say it's a UP or NA, it wouldn't be fair, because it really does depend on the personalities of the people who actually win, right?
Yes.
Because I believe the country needs stability. So if you have a party whose, let's say, ideologies might be, in sync, but if the people who actually won the seats are people that you don't feel are stable, trustworthy people, that's got to play a role in how you go forward. And so I think the country really needs stability. I mean, I've seen how much I've done in 9 months, and obviously there's a learning curve to when you come in, and I think to myself, gosh, with all the things we've done in 9 months, imagine if you had 4 years, we could, this country could rock.
Well, we certainly wish you the best of luck come September 26th. Thank you so much for being candid with us. Thank you for your time and taking time out of your busy schedule. He's the #2 candidate on the DP list, Honorable Minister Emil. Please, in conclusion, we'd love for you to say a few words to the voters to encourage them to cast their vote.
My name's Emil. I'm the #2 candidate on the DP list. And I believe in the last 9 months, I've shown the country that we have a solid plan forward. I think we've put the foundations in there for revolutionary change for the country. We're talking about a new hospital. We're talking about labor reform. We're talking about national health insurance, where we would give health insurance to all the people of the island. All I'm asking for is your support so that I can continue with our good work. Thank you very much.